Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. You're watching Alaska Weather with us on this 10th of April. Thanks for joining us. And as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information from your National Weather Service Forecast Office, as well as the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. Anytime you need help finding information, please let me know. I'm happy to serve you any way I can. And as we go into the show tomorrow, our plan, and this is just a plan, but we hope to have a breakup update for you across some of the main rivers around Alaska. We'll have Crane Johnson in helping us to understand what's happening with the breakup season now and where we expect it to go in a couple weeks here. So make sure you're watching tomorrow night, and we'll do our very best to get that update for you there from the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. You can already see some of the information on their website about breakup, and make sure you check that out if you're really interested, and we'll have more of that for you tomorrow. Let's take a look at the hazardous weather first across the region. We're looking at across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, generally a little bit of strong wind picking up and grabbing some of that loose snow and blowing that around. So we expect visibility to be impaired just a little bit as we go into tonight and tomorrow and into early Friday morning. So this is going to last through early Friday morning. It looks like at least some reduction of visibility, maybe down to a half mile or so. Not the worst you've seen, but still maybe a little bit worse than you have seen in the last 24 hours. The other part of this is with some wind moving across the region from the south, we expect to develop some Chinook winds on the lee side of the eastern Alaska Range, and that'll put it right over the Deltana, Tanana Flats region, Delta Junction. And we would expect to see that there's probably going to be some increased fire danger there. So when that happens, we usually reduce the humidity, which is not a good thing. The winds will be up, and of course we have a lot of dry brush across the region left over and has been drying since the snow has melted off. So in this area, we expect to see elevated fire danger, and as a result of that, of course, a red flag warning, the first of the season there, I believe, for the central and eastern interior as we go. So make sure that you're being extra careful with fire. If you have questions, check in with your borough officials there and make sure that you know what the rules are before you do any open burning, especially in those conditions. Here's a look at Wednesday, and low pressure is working its way in from the south and west across the central chain in the North Pacific. You can see the clouds billowing up there. Another kind of puff of clouds rotating around low pressure across the south and western Bering Sea, and across the interior, just not a lot of pretty there at all. It really just looks like a whole lot of leftover slop, and that's really what it is. We've got moisture moving in across parts of southeast, just kind of grazing southeast at this point. A little bit of light rainfall falling across the central and southern parts of the Panhandle, but everything up north is really just kind of the leftovers. It's really not making its way into the central and northern parts of the state at all, but we are getting some of the warmth. The mild air is certainly traveling northward. And as we go, it looks like in the next couple days or so, we're going to start to get into a little bit more of a northeasterly flow coming down through the Bering Strait and feeding into this broad circulation pattern, which could limit some of the ice growth, or enhance some of the ice growth, I should say, across the Bering Sea, but it doesn't look like it's going to be anything really substantial at this point. Probably notice a little bit more of a breeze and a little bit of a cooler air pattern there instead of just some of the milder weather that you've been seeing. Let's take a look at today's weather map, and you can see a couple fronts sitting across the interior. These are not terribly substantial, but they do represent a difference in temperature and wind patterns, and especially across the North Slope, where we've got high pressure across the Arctic Ocean, pushing in that north and easterly flow. But that's about where it stops, right along the Brooks Range summits there. Everything else south of that still remains fairly mild and really under the control of low pressure here across the southern Bering Sea and the North Pacific. We've got another wave of low pressure sitting here across the central and northern Gulf. And remember a couple days ago how we were talking about a triple point low that might bring up some stronger winds into Prince William Sound? Well, there it is. It is well south of Prince William Sound, and at this time it doesn't really look like it's going to drive its way into the Sound area at this point. So areas of light rain there around the northern Gulf Coast, but all in all, things are pretty dry and pretty quiet. We're going to see that low pressure system across the North Pacific kind of regather itself here across the central and eastern chain. And about 968 millibars will be about as low as it gets. It looks like that'll happen tonight. And ahead of that, an occluded front where that warm and cold air is kind of mixed up on itself. It's still a frontal boundary, a change in the air mass as it leads its way across southwestern Alaska and the Gulf. The winds will change, and the strongest winds will probably be back here on the west and southwest side as this is wrapping in some of the colder air coming off of the Bering Sea. Now, high pressure up north is feeding that in at 1,014 millibars west of the Gulf of Anadyr and also across the eastern parts of the interior. We're still going to have this trough, though, and so that means those winds are going to start to pick up across the eastern chain. Remember, we were talking about fire danger being a problem with that type of pattern, so that's going to develop here after tonight. Across Prince William Sound to the Kenai Fjords and Kodiak Island, wouldn't be surprised to see some light rain. Most of that will stay out of and off of most of the road system, it looks like, until we get into Thursday, and then you'll start to see some of that sneaking back into the Susitna Valley, probably into the Sterling Highway for some and over a few of the passes. Watch for snow across the higher terrain, maybe whitening the peaks just a little bit from the brown, slushy stuff we've been seeing. Look for areas of clouds across southeast. It doesn't look like you're going to see a big swath of rain arrive until maybe later on Thursday. The front's trying to break up a little bit across the Gulf and certainly across southwestern Alaska. Low pressure systems coming up to about 974. And once again, the strongest winds are going to be on the western side of this, wrapping into this overall circulation here. So places like the central and western chain, Adak, Atka, all the way out toward Kiska and Attu, you're probably looking at some stronger and blustery winds there, at least gale force throughout the day. Up north, expect blowing snow across the region. It doesn't look like we're going to see a substantial amount of new snow added to that, but we will see a reduction in visibility as a result. And for areas where the wind is not blowing as much, there actually may be fog and some flurries with that too. So do expect a colder pattern for you. Around the Brooks Range, we expect periods of rain and snow. On the north side, it looks like a better chance for snowfall. On the south side, a better chance that's going to be a rain-snow mix. And for most in the central and western and even eastern interior, things look pretty quiet and dry for you, especially with that drying northerly flow, or southerly flow coming over the Deltana and Tanana Flats region. That's what's going to promote the drier weather there and perhaps the enhanced fire danger. For Friday, low pressure sits pretty much in the same old spot. That weather pattern will continue to keep things dry across the interior. Low pressure moves across the Alaska Peninsula pretty close to Cold Bay and Sand Point. With that, we expect to see southerly winds bringing in clouds and moisture into northern and western parts of the Gulf. For southeast, a high-pressure ridge is still kind of holding on a little bit. You'll get a little bit of this wetter pattern, especially in the northern areas from Yakutat into Gustavus, Haines, Skagway toward Juneau. South of that, especially along the higher terrain, but for southern outer coast regions, Craig, Klawak, probably looking at maybe more clouds than anything else at this point. And a new low is showing up out across the western end of the map there at 979 millibars, still south of the chain for Friday. Let's talk temperatures, because in southeast it's going to be mild, upper 20s and lower 30s overnight. 41 in Kodiak, 28 around Fairbanks. Temps up north hovering close to zero from Wainwright, Prudhoe Bay, Deadhorse, Kaktovik, 0 in Utqiagvik. Teens and 20s for the Kotzebue Sound region, 20s and 30s for Norton Sound and Nome at 26. St. Lawrence Island about 20, 33 in Macoriac, and upper 30s for southwest, including Lake Iliamna, almost at 40 degrees really. In the Alaska Peninsula, closer to 40 degrees as well around Sand Point. High temperatures for your Thursday, back in the upper 40s, lower 50s. Fairbanks, North Pole, Tanana, all in the upper 40s to even upper 50s there. Just horribly hot for April. 40s and 50s for southeast, south central in the 40s as well. Kodiak 46, Utqiagvik up to 8. Overnight lows on Friday will dip below zero again on the north slope. Teens and 20s for the Kotzebue Sound region, 27 in Nome, 31 for Unalakleet, mid to upper 30s for southwest, 40 in Sand Point, 33 in St. Paul. Southeast, you're looking at temps in the upper 30s and lower 40s. Fairbanks, again, pretty mild, and certainly by Friday with a high of 55 degrees, 53 in North Pole, 52 in Eagle, and 6 in Utqiagvik.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to your aviation weather now. IFR will be widespread across the Bering, a large part of the central and eastern Aleutian chain, as well as the Alaska Peninsula and into the western Gulf around Kodiak Island. Hit and miss around Prince William Sound. You'll notice southeast has a touch of marginal conditions there on the inside, but not looking like we'll start out with IFR in the region there tomorrow. Up north, though, a different story, especially north of the Yukon Valley into the Brooks Range and the Arctic coast with widespread IFR, including areas around Kotzebue Sound and through the heart of the Seward Peninsula and through the Bering Strait. As we get into the afternoon, really substantial improvements there, so if you can wait just a little bit, you can probably get some better conditions across the Yukon Valley and southward into the YK Delta. Southwest, you'll still be dealing with marginal conditions. It looks like IFR develops around Prince William Sound and holds down to Resurrection Bay and Kenai Fjords region. Southeast should improve greatly from MVFR in the morning, and we'll still be looking at IFR fairly widespread across the Bering, which does include St. Paul and St. George there on Thursday's flying day. Out across the north, you'll notice IFR sinking in across parts of the North Slope and into the Brooks Ranges. Hit and miss around the summits, though, so you might be able to sneak through Adigan Pass or AKwx, probably not both. Out across the west, IFR across the Kotzebue Sound region through St. Lawrence Island, north and west of St. Matthew, and then hit and miss across parts of the central and eastern chain. The northern and eastern Gulf Coast starts to fill in a little bit more with IFR into the Copper River Delta, so Cordova all the way out through Yakutat and Haines, Skagway, Gustavus, and into the capital city. There south of that mainly looks like marginal conditions for Friday. And as we get into the afternoon, you'll still see lingering IFR from Nunivak Island down towards St. Paul, St. George, St. Matthew. Not too bad for IFR across the chain, but you will find a couple pockets there, and IFR lingers across the same places in the north and eastern Gulf Coast. With areas of rain there and fronts moving through, no surprise. Marginal conditions across most of south central, southwest, and the Gulf, as well as north of the Yukon Valley and through the North Slope, all the way from Wainwright and eastward toward Kaktovik. Here's your pass conditions then. AKwx and Adigan Pass, we expect IFR in the morning, leaning over toward marginal conditions as the day goes on. So probably at least a little bit of hit and miss IFR still in the region. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass go the other way. Marginal conditions in the morning, and then IFR develops in the afternoon. A rainy pass right now looks to stay or hold at marginal levels throughout your day. Windy pass, marginal levels. Isabel Pass, we start at IFR with some improvements throughout your afternoon. Mentasta Pass still improves further than that. Marginal conditions in the morning with VFR conditions later in the afternoon. We expect Tanita Pass to go through a marginal level through most of the day there, so visibility and ceiling kind of in between. Portage Pass looks like mostly down. IFR conditions there through a good chunk of the day, and Chilkoot and White Pass should see a little more improvement as we get into the rest of the day, but again, it's going to go back to IFR probably by Friday, so use your Thursday wisely there in northern southeast. Freezing levels tell us that there's a lot of warm and wet air moving northward. You can see the freezing level jumping to about 2,000 feet around the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, and that jogs southward into the Dixon entrance. But south of that, the next weather maker there is bringing up quite a bit of warm and wet air, so levels are coming up as much as 6, 7, 8, 10,000 feet. Across the interior, north of the Alaska Range, we still have levels that are dropping to about 2,000 feet and above, but some warmer air pockets there certainly forming in the region. The surface freezing line now north toward the Yukon Delta and into the western sections of Alaska, and then dropping southward quickly below the Alaska Range into the Kenai Peninsula for Thursday morning. Icing potential has still that split level across the North Slope. Below 2,000 feet looks pretty good for icing. Above 7,000 feet looks pretty good for icing. In between, not so much. Too warm. It looks like areas in southwest and south central are holding between about 6,000 and 8,000 feet all the way out through the Aleutian Chain. Above 9,000 feet there, with isolated moderates still possible in that region. Our jet stream has low pressure across the southern Bering. South of that is the main Pacific core, and you can see that running around 165 to 170 knots. That's keeping most of the really active weather away from the region, but it is spinning up those lows and sending them into the Gulf, and some of that is being pulled back into the Bering Sea. Up north, the really cold air bypassing most of Alaska with the exception of the North Slope, and a lot of that is moving into the lower 48. So they're getting the cold and we're getting the warm. At 9,000 feet, you can see that southwesterly flow coming in across the Gulf. Easterlies blowing offshore, 20 to 50 knots there. A ridge over southeast, and southerlies moving into the North Slope. A similar pattern at 3,000 feet. 60 to 70 knots here across the western Gulf and southern Bering Sea. Easterlies strong offshore, blowing off the YK Delta. Southerlies over southeast, starting in at 60 knots and slowing down to 15 to 20 knots up north. So turbulence, you betcha. In fact, there could be some isolated severe around south central tomorrow, including the Kenai Peninsula. Widespread considerable moderate from southwest to south central, the northern Gulf, and all of the Aleutian Chain.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the earth and grows our food. While the sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the sun doesn't stay at the sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. And this is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane about 30, 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what the spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from the space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system is going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And on to your sea ice update now. You'll notice that we haven't really changed a whole lot since yesterday's update. More than marginal ice, the higher concentration areas of white showing up generally along and north of St. Lawrence Island and west of the Bering Strait. We're going to see continued areas of north and easterly winds, so a lot of this is probably going to move away from the Seward Peninsula and certainly be on the move in the Norton Sound region. Any high concentration ice may start to drift a little bit further west, and we'll probably continue to see some polynyas here in the upper end of the Kotzebue Sound region. No major changes, though, across the North Slope for now. You can check out the very latest sea ice outlook. That's posted on the sea ice page. That's weather.gov/Anchorage/ice for the updates there. That'll take you through the rest of the spring and into summer season. For southeast, look for light winds on the inside passage. Southeasterlies there in Lynn Canal, northeasterlies inside of Stevens Passage, and easterlies across Clarence Strait, all looking at about 2-foot seas there. A southeast flow coming up the outer coast, anywhere from 20 to about 35 knots. Once you get west of Yakutat, though, winds really come up to about 40 knots with a 15-foot sea in that region. As we get into Friday, you'll notice that front has passed through the region. It's falling apart, so it won't be terribly strong when it comes through in the first place, but winds are going to shift. A south and westerly flow, 15 knots there. Seas up to 19 feet around Icy Cape and Cape Fairweather. Southerlies on the inside passage up to 25 knots around the Lynn Canal with a 5-foot sea. Inside of Prince William Sound, easterlies there, 40 knots with a 10-foot sea. South and easterly flow across the north and western Gulf, 40 to 50 knots, 16-foot seas. East of the Barren Islands, and still some of that stronger winds making it in across the western side too. Seas there 19 feet outside of Kashamak Bay. Northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, 25 to 30 with 8 to 10-foot seas. Becoming more south and southeasterlies we go into your Friday, a 10 to 20 knot wind there, 20 to 25 across the northern Gulf, and southeasterlies sustained at 15 inside of Prince William Sound with a 3-foot sea. For the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay, we're looking at sharp southwest winds coming in across the Pacific coast, 40 to 50 knots. Storm force winds in this case, we're 32 to 37-foot seas. Some of the higher seas also making their way into the eastern side of Kodiak Island. Shelikof Strait, 40 knots with a 14-foot sea from the south and east. Easterlies over Bristol Bay, southwesterlies across the Bering Sea coast there of the Alaska Peninsula. And that still is rotating around areas of low pressure across the south and eastern parts of the Bering and Bristol Bay. As this is coming in from the south and southwest, winds are expected to diminish, though, as we go through the day. 25 to about 35 knots, sustained winds 20 in Shelikof Strait, 25 east of Kodiak Island, and about 10 to 28-foot seas there on the Pacific side, and only 6 to 7 across the Bering Sea coast side, so much improvement there. Across the Aleutians in the west, a west and northwesterly flow is expected on Thursday. West and southwesterly the further east you go. Still looking at some storm force winds in the region and certainly high-end gales. Anywhere from 45 to 50 there from Nikolsky to Unalaska, and seas coming up to 27 to 34 feet. That improves on Friday. Westerly flow will mostly be the rule, 20 to about 35 knots in some areas. 9 to 13 foot seas, you're looking at about 19 to 21 foot seas across the Pacific coast side, especially south of Atka to Nikolsky. And look at the winds sharpening from the north and east. They're coming around a little bit more in the wake of another trough that's passing through the western chain. North and easterly winds like we were talking about across the west coast and northwest for sure. Anywhere from about 30 knots to 40 knots coming into the Kuskokwim Delta, 10 to 14 foot seas, 16 foot seas around St. Matthew, 12 foot seas for St. Paul and St. George, all blowing in from the north and east. Winds will shift a little bit more to the north as you get up north of Macoriac up towards St. Lawrence Island, 20 to 25. Looking for 7 to 11 foot seas, 25 knots there around St. Paul and St. George, and northeasterlies over the ice and the marginal ice at that across Norton Sound, 15 knots and 2 foot seas. For the North Slope, easterlies blowing over the ice, 25 to 30. Again, a blowing snow advisory posted for the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast as a result of that. East and northeasterlies over the Chukchi Sea, 15 to 25, again over the ice. As we get into Friday, north and easterly winds will still be in charge in that area, 20 to 25. You're looking at about 30 to 35 knot winds sustained over the Beaufort with northerlies in the Bering Strait. Let's recap your weather for tonight. A red flag warning has been issued for the Deltana and Tanana Flats region there, as Chinook winds are expected to come up as we go into your Thursday. We're also looking at a winter weather advisory across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast. Everything else is generally quiet. Gales will be fairly widespread across the Bering and the Aleutians into the western Gulf. By Thursday, rain's trying to make its way into southeast. A dying weather front here moving across the Gulf will stir up the winds across south central, southwest, and certainly the Aleutian chain as we just saw in your marine maps. Behind that, north and westerly winds will bring some cool and snowy weather out toward the western chain, and blowing snow will still be a problem up across some parts of the Beaufort Seacoast. By Friday, showery weather across south central and southwest with a little bit of rain working its way into northern parts of southeast. Have a good night.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.